Hi everyone, I'm Jen and I'm so glad you're here. Today, let's geek out about the best books I read in each month of 2024. We're going to take a look inside my 2024 reading journal at my Hall of Fame spread. And we are not going to focus on the places where I messed up the boxes. I've definitely had to live with that all year, but now we're getting to the point where I can paste in the book cover image for each of the books and forget that that's even there. I like to have my best books for each month because then I put them into my head-to-head spread to find my favorite book of the year. And I also do a traditional book bracket. You can kind of see it penciled in here, ready to go for when I'm ready to get to this particular spread. If you're interested in seeing those, stay tuned because I will be making videos for those as well. But for right now, I have to start out with the best book that I read in each month. And you can see that I've already chosen January. To do that, though, I have handy dandy little printouts of all the things that I read in each month. And so for January, I read some interesting things. January, I read a variety of things, including some series recommended to me by my friend Mike. And I have some books in here that I don't know. At the time, I felt like I was reading very interesting things and I was very happy with the things that I was reading. But looking back at it, I'm kind of like, it's kind of a blah month. Like, the book that I picked to win previously, because I did do that one at the beginning of the year, was Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. And I'm going to stick with that's the best book I read in January. But now, knowing all of the things that I read all year, if I had read that in a different month, it might not have won. Like, there are plenty of other things in other months that I'm sure we'll see it and we'll get to that I like better than that. It just happens that of what I read in January, that's my favorite. So that's the one I'm going to pick for January. And normally I'd be going in and penciling that back into my reading journal, except that, as you saw a second ago, I already did. So then let's look at what I read in February. In February, I read a lot of things. I finished up that Annihilation trilogy, the Southern Reach trilogy, which I was really liking at the time, but now that it's sat with me, I did not enjoy it all that much. I read The Goddess of Yesterday by Carolyn B. Cooney, which was a recommendation from a friend. I do kind of a book club with some of my coworkers. That was one of her recommendations. I read the short story The Six Deaths of the Saint by Alex E. Harrow. I listened to The Sandman, which was an Audible one, which is very interesting because it's a collection of comic books that they've then turned into an audiobook. And so it's not like with a regular book, you just read the book out loud and that's how you make an audiobook. But like, how do you do that with a comic book? And actually, I feel like they did it very successfully. So that one was interesting. I read Monstrilio by Gerardo Ramona Cordova, and I loved it. It was so weird. It was so the discussions of grief and just weirdness, some LGBTQ rep. I really liked Monstrilio. I Have Some Questions for You by Rebecca Mackay was a mystery novel. Read Under the Whispering Door by TJ Klune with my coworkers. We very much enjoyed it. I read The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. And if I'm looking at these, I'm really struggling. There were some that I very much did not like. The Goddess of Yesterday was not to my cup of tea. It's a kid's book, and as an adult reading it, it had nothing for me. It's just a basic retelling of a story I already know without adding anything interesting for me. But had I read it as a kid, I'm sure I would have loved it. But reading it as an adult, going back, there's some kids' books that do hold something for an adult reader, but this one for me was not it. For me, it's kind of, as much as I love Monstrilio, it's kind of between these two. I Have Some Questions for You and Under the Whispering Door. And as I look at it, as I think about it in terms of the whole reading experience, I think partly because I shared this one with other people, it's got to be Under the Whispering Door. So I'm going to stick that in here, Under the Wisp Door, because I'm going to actually paste the thing and I'm just keeping track for my own self so that I know what I picked. And then in March, I didn't read quite as much. February was a pretty good month. There's a lot in there that in a different month, especially like in January, Monstrilio would have won in January over the things I read. I Have Some Questions for You would have won in January over the things I read in January, but they can't beat the things I read in February. Anyway, let's move on to March. So in March, I read East of Eden as a reread. I read it in high school, but I reread it. I read As Good as Dead by Holly Jackson, which is the third one in that trilogy. I very much did not like it. Like, that is not winning. Even now, remembering it, I'm getting angry at how much potential that book had and how good it could have been. And then the ways that I feel like it entirely undid all of Pip's characterization from the previous books. Not my favorite. I read The Brutal Telling by Louise Penny, which is the third, some number of book in her Inspector Gamache series. And I really loved it too. And then I read a collection of short stories from Ray Bradbury called The Golden Apples of the Sun, which I really liked, but short story collections for me have an issue where some of the stories are really great and some of the stories are kind of not so great, and then some things are kind of mediocre in the middle. And so as a collection, it's kind of in the middle. It's okay. It's good. There are some stories in there that I had read before and are favorites. There were some new favorites that I found in this collection. And then there were some stories that I don't remember at all. And even if I flipped through the book, I probably couldn't tell you what they were or what they were about because I read them, but they just weren't doing anything for me. So that one's kind of out because of the uneven up and down nature of short story collections in general. So it's probably between East of Eden and The Brutal Telling. And man, I loved The Brutal Telling. I love what she did with the characters of murder mysteries where your characters are safe, right? Because you know that they're going to come back for the next book in the series. She kind of did something interesting related to the concept of The Brutal Telling that made this a typical book. Like, those characters weren't safe. As much as I loved it, though, it's probably got to be East of Eden. And I am not saying that as somebody who wants to be seen a certain way or like, ooh, I read classic books. And so I am so very, I don't know, smart or pretentious or whatever. But I reread it and I just really loved the descriptions, the sort of down-home personal feel of East of Eden as he describes his family and weaves his family in as characters in this tale that is epic because of its biblical borrowings. Like, even if you're not a classics person, go check out East of Eden. It's pretty good. Not Grapes of Wrath. Leave Grapes of Wrath alone. But go check out East of Eden. I very much enjoyed coming back to it and reading it again as an adult in a situation where no one was making me read it. Because that always affects how much I like a book, for whether I was forced to read it or not, or whether I just read it for my own pleasure. And I found that East of Eden totally holds up. In April, I read The Blade Itself, which is the beginning of a trilogy, and I liked it, but I kind of didn't like it. I think I was in the wrong headspace for that trilogy when I read it, and that's not really the book's fault, but it also colors my opinion and my flavoring of, is it the best book I read in April? Probably not, but had I read it when I was in the mood for it and a book like it, it might have been. But it was, again, one of my coworkers' book club pick, and I read it when we were reading it together, and I just wasn't super in the mood for it. The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde was also a pick from that group of coworkers. I liked it a lot more than they did, but partly because, like, the history of the Dominican Republic was something that I know. I speak Spanish, and that was a somewhat necessary skill for getting through The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. I kept thinking about them as I was reading, like, do they know what that word means? Is that going to get into it? And the gal who picked it ended up not liking it as much as I did, but I liked it. The Mother-Daughter Murder Night was kind of blah for me. I just didn't really connect to the characters or care. Poison Study is an old favorite. I read it way back in the day when I worked at Borders. It was a recommendation from my sales manager, who is still a good friend of mine. And she said, you got to read this book. And I did. And then there was a whole trilogy. And we passed it around the bookstore and our local customer base. Like, we made everybody we know read Poison Study. And I was kind of in a reading slump. Like, I was really, really struggling to read some things or read interesting things or stay on task with reading, especially reading print, because I read so many audiobooks, that I picked up Poison Study again, and it did exactly what I needed it to do, which was to break me out of my slump and get me reading again. And I did that by revisiting an old favorite. So as much as I really love Poison Study, it feels like cheating. Like I read it because it was a favorite. And also, I'm not sure how great the book actually is. Like, it's a 5-star read for me. It's going to stay a 5-star read for me. But some of that is also the memories tied up with the people that also read it when I worked at the bookstore, and the time in my life that I was in when I read that book is part of what I love about the book, and the text itself, to like recommend it to somebody else who doesn't have those, associations and thoughts around it. I'm not sure that it's the greatest book for somebody else, but please read Poison Study. Let me know if it holds up as a first-time reader, or if all of my love of Poison Study is surrounded and tied up in my friends that I worked with at Borders. And then I read Dungeon Crawler Carl, and oh my gosh, I love Dungeon Crawler Carl. I actually read it twice. So if you are counting up my books and have recognized that I read 70 books last year, you will not see 70 covers, and some of that is things like Dungeon Crawler Carl and also Hamlet, which we'll talk about in May, that I have read more than once in a year. I only included their cover once as I was tracking what I had read and when. Oh my gosh, for April it has to be Dungeon Crawler Carl. It just has to be Dungeon Crawler Carl, which I am going to abbreviate on here as DCC. I loved this story. I did not know lit RPG was a thing. It kept getting recommended everywhere in a bunch of spaces that I'm in. Everybody kept saying Dungeon Crawler Carl. And then that same coworker book club, we were trying to figure out the next thing we were going to read, and I had mentioned that like I'm interested in reading that, and one of my friends had already read it and was like, oh, then that's my pick, because you guys need to read Dungeon Crawler Carl. And that's the whole point of that book club for us. It started with making each other read our favorites so that we had things to talk about. We had other book type people to talk about our favorite books with. And it started with me. I teach English for a living. And one of my fellow English teachers, where I had read Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood, which I think might possibly be my favorite book of all time. And I needed to be able to talk about it with other literature type people. So I wanted my coworker to read it so that I could talk about it with him. And he agreed that he would read it if I would read dragon books with him. And so that's how that started. I made him read Oryx and Crake. He made me read Dragon Riders of Pern. And then we just kept switching off books. We have a science teacher who reads with us now. We have a special education teacher who reads with us now. We haven't picked anything for this year. We should probably get on that. Guys, if you're watching, we need to come up with a book club book. Anyway, in May. Oh, the things I read in May. As I mentioned, I teach English for a living, so this is the part of the year where you will start seeing a lot of Shakespeare show up on my reading list. And if this is about the best book I read, then it's Hamlet. It's always Hamlet. It's always going to be Hamlet. I love Hamlet. I love that my job lets me read Hamlet multiple times a year with my students. Because I love Hamlet, they end up loving Hamlet. I freaking love Hamlet. But it feels like cheating to pick Hamlet for the same kind of discussion we were having about the Poison Study up here. It feels like I, can't pick Hamlet because I read Hamlet every year, and I'm always going to pick Hamlet. And so it's not kind to let none of the other books get a shot because I read it in the same month with Hamlet, and I read some really great things this month. So it's not Hamlet. I don't want to have two Dungeon Crawler Carls. Like, I liked this, but not as well as the first one. So that one being April seems sufficient. I read Romeo and Juliet with my freshman. Amir Amended I really liked, but because it's kind of novella length, it suffers for me. Like, I don't know, there's something about it being short that I end up liking less, and so it's hard for me to pick that as my best book. I reread All Systems Red with the coworker book club. I didn't like it as much the second time around, which was oddly, again, this probably has to do with it being towards the end of the school year and being stressed and not really in the right headspace. I did really like Murder Your Employer. It was cute, and it was narrated by Neil Patrick Harris, at least some of it. I think the other narrator was Simon Vance. Pretty sure it was Simon Vance. And so, I'll listen to anything to listen to Neil Patrick Harris talk for a while. And it was fun and it was good. I liked How to Solve Your Own Murder. It was cute. It does some of the trope things of having two storylines, and there's a past and a present storyline, and they come together and we see how they're solved. I liked the main character. I liked the town. I liked the kind of traditional Englishy retirement, quiet town trope getting played out in a slightly different way. So it's probably How to Solve Your Own Murder because it's not Hamlet. I did not enjoy The Leftover Woman. This was poorly marketed to me. It was marketed as like mystery thriller. It was neither of those things. And it was a decent book, but it wasn't what I was in the mood for when I picked it. Like, I wanted a mystery thriller, and it just really wasn't that. And then it wasn't what I wanted, and so my enjoyment of it went down. And it's sometimes hard for me to separate the quality of the book versus my enjoyment. Sometimes it's not, but in this particular case, it definitely was a difficult thing to do for me. So not that. And then in June, I read Macbeth. I actually read Macbeth twice, once in May and once in June. I read King Lear with my college class. I read Twelfth Night with my sophomores. I read a lot of Shakespeare in June. And again, they are not going to win because I read them every year as much as I do love King Lear. I really enjoyed The Lost Queen, which was like, people are describing it as like Celtic stuff meets King Arthur by Signe Pike. This book was really good. It very much scratched a linguistic history of English, Celtic influence itch that I didn't really know I had. It was good. Oh, The City We Became. I really loved The City We Became. It's weird. I love N.K. Jemison's work. If you have not read N.K. Jemison's work, like, stop watching this video right now and go read the Obelisk trilogy, the Stone Obelisk trilogy, or something like that. You'll find it. It was amazing. Dungeon Crawler Carl, the Dungeon Anarchist Cookbook. This book is the book that got me to almost stop reading this series. I really did not enjoy this one with the trains and the stuff, and I wasn't into it. My husband got me back reading the series again later in the year because he kept going, but I might have stopped it with Dungeon Crawler Carl after this one if I didn't have somebody else in my life who was like, it's that one. Oh, Legends and Lattes. Oh man, this is so hard. I'm going to leave those alone for a second. Language Death is a textbook by David Crystal, who is a linguist, dealing with like how languages die, what caused them to die, what steps we can take to prevent them. I found it very interesting. Linguistics is what my background is in, and I love David Crystal's work. So like, I found it really interesting, but for a more general audience, it's not going to be the best thing anyone read that month, even though I did really enjoy it. Oh man, it's The City We Became or it's Legends and Lattes. Oh no, I loved them both. They both were so good. So this was like cozy fantasy, which I didn't know was a thing or that I needed it in my life. I learned a lot last year that I didn't know I needed in my life. Oh, Legend. Okay, I'm thinking about like a fictional friend sitting in front of me and trying to tell them which of these two books to read if I find out that they have not read either of them. Oh, it's gonna be Legends and Lattes. It has to be Legends and Lattes. But if you haven't read any N.K. Jemisin and you haven't read The City We Became, you really, really should. And see, this is a struggle that I have because, again, in a different month where I was struggling to find a book that I liked, like January, where I had no 5-star reads, The City We Became would have easily won that out. But because it's in the same month as something else I also really loved, it just seems wrong a little bit to have. But for this Hall of Fame, this is the best book of each month. So I am picking the best book of each month. But when we get over to this head-to-head, I may choose to not go strictly by these and to kick out some of the ones that kind of won their category by default by being the best of what was available rather than a legitimately best thing I read this year. I may kick those ones out and then put a substitute in over here because there are some months like May not May, but like June where I have multiple books that I really enjoyed that I'm kind of sad and upset that they're not going to make it to the Hall of Fame simply because I read them in a month where I read something equally as good and maybe slightly better. This one's slightly better because of vibes for me. So yeah. Okay, let's move on to July. Oh, good. I get to make it up. Okay, because like, what if I put in The World We Make as July's book, and then it can kind of maybe a little bit represent both in this duology? It's cheating, but also this is my game and I can play it however I want. So what else did I read in July? I read Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. Ooh, which was pretty good. I did enjoy that. But it's Agatha Christie, and if you've read one, they're all kind of similar. This one's a little different. I read Imagined Communities, which is a nonfiction, almost textbook about nationalism and the rise of nationalism and how that works. And while it was very interesting and informative and enjoyable, I was not reading it at a time that was helpful. Like, I was reading it in my before bed slot, which is not when I should be reading textbooks that I require me to, really pay attention to content and like look up words and do heavy lifting in terms of the things that I'm thinking about right before bed. And also it's a textbook, so it's probably never gonna win for me as like the best thing I read, although it was very interesting. And I reread Harry Potter with my kid that month. So yeah, okay, so it's The World We Make. Legitimately, that is the best for me of the 4 things that I read in July. But it also makes me very happy that it is now getting to represent the city we became, which I kicked out in favor of Legends and Lattes. So that's good. That's making me feel really good about that decision. Okay. In August, I always think, just one second, because I'm a teacher, I always think I'm going to read a ton of books in July, and then I never do. I'm always like, oh, I'll have so much time and I will read, but then I don't make my commute. And most of my reading happens through audiobooks on my commute. And because I'm not going anywhere in July, I don't get as much reading accomplished in July. I need to fix that this year. That should be a focus. Anyway, in August, I read a mystery book called Not a Happy Family. I read another kind of mystery, not exactly a mystery, but like, what is happening? What's going on here? What's the big story? Kate Morton's Homecoming. Oh, I read Nabokov's favorite word is mauve. Or mauve. I'm an American, so I say mauve, but lots of people say mauve. Anyway, I really loved this. It's kind of a linguistic analysis or a computational linguistics analysis of authors. Like, men and women use different emotion words differently. So like one of the things I remember from this book is that male authors don't show male characters as crying, or maybe that's backwards. Maybe female authors did both, but men authors made male characters cry, but female authors never did. I can't remember. Anyway, it was really interesting, but as you can tell, I didn't retain a super lot of it. But like, which author's favorite word, like what word do they use more in their work compared to all of the other like words, or the frequency of those words in text sets. Yeah, reading levels, things like it was really cool, and it was really interesting, and it's very much up my alley, but it is probably not an appeal to a wider audience. I really liked The Book Eaters as well. That was a fantasy thing, kind of vampires, but they eat books, and then she's trying to live in modern society. It took me a while to get into it and to like grasp what is going on here and to care what was going on here, but once I did, I did really enjoy it. And then Make Time was a productivity book, which was kind of, whatevsies. It had really good information in it, but I've been struggling to actually try to apply any of that to me. Not that it doesn't apply, it definitely does, but I'm not doing the work I'm supposed to do to like take what was in this book and apply it and make my life better. And so because I'm not doing that work in my brain, I'm like, yeah, that book was okay. It would be amazing if I would actually, do something with the information I learned. Looking at these, it's probably between Homecoming and The Book Eaters. And honestly, I could be happy with either of those choices. I think I'm gonna go with Homecoming, although that could easily have gone the other way. So if you read both of those, let me know if you think that I made the wrong choice. Like, should I have picked The Book Eaters instead, or did I do the right thing by picking Homecoming? Because in my brain, they're kind of equal. And again, in a different month, I might have both of them on my Hall of Fame. But because I read them both in August, they're just kind of sitting there above the rest of the pack. And yeah, I'm going with Homecoming. In September, I read TJ Klune's Somewhere Beyond the Sea with my coworkers, which I did really like, but not nearly as much as the first one, as The House in the Cerulean Sea, which we read in 2023. I read the second volume of the Sandman comic books as audiobook. I read The Name of This Book is Secret with my kid, which has been really fun because I very much enjoyed this book. I found it when I worked at Borders, and it was super cute. And it's fun for me to read it with her now that she's old enough to be reading longer chapter books. I also read The Memory Police. Oh, it's The Memory Police. Yeah, it's definitely The Memory Police. This month was easy. I really loved this story. It was just so differently told, and the way that the story mirrors the society. Like, it takes place in Japan, and the government, I guess, society, people come in and erase the memories, and so then they don't have a concept for birds anymore, and everything to do with birds has to go away, and we don't talk about birds, and they lose it. And it's in the story that the people legitimately don't remember the things anymore. Like, at first they're just pretending that they don't remember, but then they don't. And like, even when people start losing limbs, they don't remember the limb anymore. But then there's a character who does remember, and he can't really understand the world and how they don't remember, and she can't understand him and how he does remember. Yeah, it was really good. It was very kind of different fiction style. If you've not read The Memory Keeper, or The Memory Police, excuse me, you really should. So, Memory Police, that's what we're going to stick in there. And then, in October, I read, not trashy, but trashy murder mystery, just fun, super, super quick read. I like Lucy Foley's stuff generally. She kind of writes the same way every time, so I felt really confident in this one that, like, ooh, I know how this is going to go. And I saw a lot of the twists coming and was able to predict what was happening, but there were still a few in there that I didn't see coming. How to read nonfiction like a professor. I enjoyed it. It was good. Whatever. Weaver and the Witch Queen. I did really enjoy it. It took me a long time to get into it. I read Genevieve Gornichek's The Witch's Heart last year, or 2023, and absolutely loved it. Keep recommending it to students who are looking for a mythology retelling. And then this was kind of in the same vein, but not exactly Norse mythology, or if it's based on Norse mythology, it's a story I don't know, about two girls, well, two sisters and then another girl, and the way that their lives interweave. I did really enjoy that. I read Stephen Fry's Ghost Stories collection, so it's not stuff he wrote, but he collected some ghost story fiction and compiled it together into a collection. And of course, it's October, so I read that, and it was fun, but you know, it just kind of is. Again, short story collections, we don't always get along. I really like some, don't like others. This Is How You Lose a Time War. I did really enjoy This Is How You Lose a Time War. It was quick and it was fun, and it was interesting to see the way that those two characters interact as they are on opposite sides of a futuristic sci-fi war type thing through history and the strands of time, but they fall in love with each other and leave sort of hints, messages, memories for each other throughout the different timelines that they're jumping through. It was cute. It was fun. I really liked that one author wrote one character and the other author wrote the other character. It kind of helped keep them having distinct voices. I finally read An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge because I never had, and one of the history teachers I work with keeps telling kids about it, and then the kids ask me, and then I've not read it, and so I finally did. It was good. Whatever. Gate of the Feral Gods got me back into Dungeon Crawler Carl after Dungeon Anarchist's cookbook way took me out of it. So that was fun. I liked it, but Dungeon Crawler Carl is already, actually I really liked it, but Dungeon Crawler Carl is already represented on my best books. Only If You're Lucky, I know I read it. I can't remember a single thing about it. So either my time frame when I was reading or that book, something about it did not leave an impression. I'm sure if I looked up the blurb that some of it would come back to me. But that means it's not the best thing I read because it is not sticking in my brain. Yeah, the best thing I read was Weaver and the Witch Queen. So Weaver and Witch Queen. Yeah, it was really good. If you're gonna pick up some of her work, though, I would recommend that you start with The Witch's Heart, because that one just was so great for me. I loved it so much, and I like this one a lot too. November, I only read 2 books in November. This is gonna be a quick thing, hopefully. I read Anthony Horowitz's Close to Death, which is number 5 or 6 or something in his Hawthorne series. And then I finally, as an adult with an English degree who teaches English for a living, I finally read The Old Man and the Sea, which I had never read before. I knew a lot about it because, you know the plot, you know the tropes. It's a Christ figure, but he's not young, and I get it, and reminiscence and ruminations on faith. I know what it is, but, which of these things was my favorite? I don't know that I feel any kind of way about either of these things. Why can't I have it from another month when I had 2 things and couldn't pick between them? Now I have 2 things and really, do either of these go on here? If I pick Old Man in the Sea, I feel like I'm just doing it to feel fancy or smart. And I did like Close to Death, the plot of it. It's not my favorite book out of this series so far, but I did like it. So let's go with Close to Death so that I don't feel like I'm being pretentious. Close to Death. Although, I liked Old Man in the Sea, but I like having read it more than I liked reading it, if that makes any sense. And then in December, I read 3 books. I read The Monkey Wrench Gang by Edward Abbey that my friend Mike made me read. And I'm glad I read it because he recommended it. I see why he loves it so much, but it is not my thing. Environmentalist fiction. It was cool. It was interesting, but it is not really my thing. I read Ariadne by Jennifer Saint, which is a retelling of the story of Ariadne, which I found that I didn't know much about her. Like, I know she helps Theseus defeat the Minotaur, but that's about all I could have ever told you about Ariadne. I didn't know anything else from her story. So it was interesting to see a retelling that treats her as the main character and as the focus, and not just the female character that shows up to help Theseus, where Theseus is the main character. But it's Book of Doors. I really, really enjoyed the Book of Doors. It is a book where there are books with magical powers and they can do things, and the Book of Doors can open a door to anywhere. There are other books that do other different things. And of course, with objects of power, there's always somebody trying to gain them for nefarious purposes. And so then there are good guys trying to protect the books and keep them safe and keep them from being misused. And then there is an evil entity trying to gather the books for her own personal gain and subjugation of other people. I really, really liked the Book of Doors. I saw on Storygraph that it's now being listed as book 1, so there may be other books in this universe coming out, which would be cool. I'd like to revisit some of those characters, and even if they focused on some of the side characters, that'd be interesting too. So I'm interested to see where Gareth Brown takes that. Now that the hard part is done and I have picked all of my favorites for now of each book of the month, now I'm going to go clean them up. I'm going to take my journal away. I'm going to go clean it up and add those covers in, and I will be right back. And through the magical power of editing, we're back. And here's what that final spread looks like in my Hall of Fame, with all of my books from each month actually put in here. Having done this, it's been a great experience. I'm not looking forward to now doing the head-to-head and the book bracket where I have to pit these books against each other. Choosing them in some cases was very difficult, so let's save those agonizing decisions for another video. Before you go, let me know in the comments if you have months where you read all the best books and months when everything you read is just blah. Like, would you have had the same experience trying to do this with each month, where some of them were amazing and you can't pick, and some of them are kind of all blah, so you can't pick? Thanks for geeking out with me today. Let's hang out together again soon.